Welcome back to part 3 of our session on the Abeka reading program and the science of reading. Again, I am Cindy Quinlan. This is my friend and colleague, Maranatha Sweet. In the last 2 parts, we had introduced the concept of the science of reading. We'd also discussed of why we are bringing it up at this time as we talk about the Abeka reading program, seeking to answer some questions that some people have, seeking perhaps to add a deeper layer of understanding to those who currently are using the Abeka reading program, because it's easy for us as educators to look at a certain subject and isolate that subject, and not always remember that there are, especially in the younger grades, there are concepts that students are learning under other categories that are working together to build up their skills, in this case, their skill of reading. So we had discussed that there are 5 common elements that are considered part of the science of reading. So for those of you who want to practice your retrieval practice with us, that first element was, Maranatha?
The phonemic awareness.
The second element was
phonics.
And so in this part and in the next part, we're going to cover those last 3, and that's going to be fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. We used and referred to that original illustration of Scarborough's rope just to emphasize the complexity of reading, because even though we are dividing the science of reading into 5 basic parts, we know it's all about how those parts are intertwined, how they're used, how long you spend on them or don't. That really adds to the reading process. So with that idea of Scarborough's rope saying part of reading has to do with word recognition, being able to read a word, the other part having to do with language comprehension, this third element, fluency, really is kind of the transition. I kind of see fluency, to be fluent and expressive, you need comprehension, but also to be fluent, you need that word recognition. So it's taking that phonemic awareness and phonics that we have been developing. It's helping them lead to reading accurately, automatically, and expressively. And from that, we can then build on into those other avenues of reading. So before we get too far ahead, let's just stop. Let's talk about fluency as an element of the science of reading. And of course, we're going to also discuss how we bring that in our program too.
So fluency would definitely be an ultimate goal for children as they learn to read. We want them to get to that point, as Cindy already said, that they read accurately, meaning they read the words that are on the page, not adding any words, not skipping words, or even, as we'll sometimes do with the children, missing endings of words. So accurately be reading what's on the page, and automatically means that they have been able to move past the stage of decoding and taking time to sound out the letters. Now they can read without thinking about it, without consciously applying the phonics, even though...
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Would that be orthographic mapping that we spent so much time on in our last part?
Exactly. That would be that we're mentally... We've gotten to a point that we no longer have to stop and think about it. We have the orthographic mapping in our brains now. Again, so it's not that we don't use the phonics. We're just no longer aware that we're applying that, according to what the scientists have determined by putting electrodes on people's brains.
It was a shocking discovery. Sorry, keep going.
And then the third portion of that, as she mentioned, was reading expressively, so that we would be reading out loud with appropriate feeling. And you would notice that for us as teachers to be able to evaluate or help fluency to improve, we definitely need students to be reading out loud so that we can hear them. We can evaluate comprehension in many ways, but fluency, broadly speaking, we need to hear them in order to be able to help them to improve. When we think about reading with expression, that includes things like their tone, the pitch, the rhythm, the emphasis, and even the volume that they read with. It helps to show the emotion of the story. It helps them to add emphasis where it's appropriate. And definitely, as she said, with comprehension, they go hand in hand. The better you comprehend, the better you can read expressively. But on the other hand, reading with appropriate expression also helps you to fully understand the story or the passage that's being read. So those 3 elements help us to achieve fluency.
And reading teachers of some of those younger children, we are not overlooking the fact that you have some children that can read with beautiful expression that have no idea what's going on. So while expression can often indicate comprehension, that's why comprehension also comes out with those questions that we ask them and with their ability to talk about what they've read. But certainly it is one of the signs with it. And then I know you have a number of examples, Maranatha, from our readers of just how it's bringing together the phonics and putting it in their topics and their stories.
We have a number of readers for each grade level, and I've just picked out the first one here for first grade, and with Fun with Pets, which is really intentionally applying the phonics as they begin in a reader. This particular one is starting with one vowel words, which of course is going to bring it right down to the phonics level. And then as they read through this book, they progress to the two vowel words. But at the same time, the teacher is helping the student to improve by reading in phrases and reading whole sentences smoothly. We might say they should read like they talk, that we don't break up what we're reading with unnatural pauses. Now, we are hoping or training them to put in appropriate pauses where there are commas, where there are periods or other punctuation marks, that those help us to know when to pause. But other than that, we want them reading in phrases to be able to keep that thought process together. So if we were to take a look at the pages that the children are reading, it starts with reading words, practicing reading some of the sight words. We haven't really delved into sight words yet in this discussion. That's another piece of vocabulary that in the Abeka reading program means one specific thing, and in other reading programs means something very different. So it's worth mentioning here since we're seeing them on the sample page. The sight words, that, as we would call them, are words that don't follow the phonics rules, like the words the and two very common articles that it's almost impossible to read a sentence without encountering. Therefore, our students need to know what to do with them very early in their reading career, if we could call it that. And we teach them that these words, that they'll still recognize by their spelling, simply don't follow the rules. And we'll help them when they first are exposed to them by bringing them out in a different color. You'll notice on this page, those sight words are in red. And we teach them how to pronounce them. They practice them as sight words, but again, that's the way we describe words that don't follow the phonics rules. In other reading programs, sight words would mean literally recognizing words by sight. We go back to the terminology we were discussing on our previous session. We talked about logographs, where you're memorizing the word as a picture. And that's not what we're talking about when we use sight words in our reading program.
Some teachers, some of you are familiar with kindergarten teacher Mrs. Crystal Turner, how she introduces sight words as something different and special than words that can be read phonetically by calling on Mr. Sight Word. We were talking with another former kindergarten teacher that whenever she taught sight words, they were words that were in timeout. And so because they were bad, they weren't obeying the rules. And so whenever her students saw those words, they were like, oh, this is a word that needs to go in timeout. So there's just different ways to emphasize to the young children that these words are different and they don't follow the phonics rules that they've been learning.
And then if we take a little bit further along into the readers, this is still a first grade reader. Kind and Brave is the fifth in our series that we recommend. And again, the connection to phonics is still very intentional. But by the fifth reader, the students have definitely grown in their reading skills to the point that we're working on more areas in their reading. We're working on, in this particular one, cultivating lasting character traits. I shouldn't say just this particular one. That's honestly the truth with all of our readers and the stories. But still working to recognize and apply phonetic sounds. And this particular reader would be working with those coming from charts 10 and 11. So a specific group of our special sounds that we've learned, and practicing reading words with suffixes. When we talked about reading accurately and not missing endings of words, the suffixes definitely tend to suffer in that area.
No pun intended.
Well, perhaps a little bit of intention. And then the student's going to be challenged to consider the material and draw conclusions from it with interpretive questions. And you'll notice that those are going to be marked with asterisks to help draw the attention for the teacher to know that these are going to be questions the students need to think about a little bit more, and therefore they need a little extra help and support when they first start to answer those kinds of questions.
And allow me to interject here because you have it displayed on the slide where you have highlighted the student will develop reading skills while cultivating lasting character traits. While this session in all its parts is primarily about developing reading and comprehension, we don't want to separate it, because when you first started talking about the science of reading in the first part of this session, you emphasized, look at all of these elements that are coming in together, and you highlighted the fact that what is not there is biblical truth. And we're aware of the lack and what that brings about. But I'm grateful for the fact that even as our students are developing their reading skills, we are building in that character. We are building in those biblical truths. And some of you may not be as familiar with the reading program, or simply may not know that in many ways our theme verse for our readers, from our younger students all the way up into our seniors in high school, is Philippians 4:8. We want our students focusing on things that are true, things that are honest, things that are just, pure, lovely, and good report. We want them to be developing those virtuous traits. And a lot of that comes from what their mind is dwelling on. So we're not going to lose the opportunity that even as they are learning their phonics, that they are going to be dwelling on truths, some as simple as justice, some as long lasting as salvation in the gospel. And that can be and should be a part of the reading program as well. All right, I'll get off my soapbox and I'll let you continue with fluency, and specifically this first grade reader.
Well, it's certainly an important soapbox. It brings us back to the reason that we teach children how to learn, that ultimately that's to be able to read the Bible, but understanding that reading is going to influence the children. And as teachers, we want to choose what we expose the children to very carefully, because we know that it will have a powerful influence on them. So yes, as we continue to consider how we help them to improve in their fluency, again, following along in the kind and brave reader, we give them words to practice that we would help them to work through, to decode, to sound out before we would read a selection. This improves their comprehension. And I know that's another one of our separate elements, but again, it's very difficult to separate them. You really can't. Pieces work together in accomplishing our goals. But this allows our students to have worked through them before they read them in the selection, and therefore understand the selection better, because they're not bogged down in the decoding or in the defining of it. The teacher can help. It's words that the students are not familiar with before they would begin reading. So in this particular case, because remember, we're working on words that use suffixes, they're working here with some review words that have suffixes, and the students are going to go through and circle those to draw their attention to them. That's very much what we work with for our students, is helping them to pay attention to the details and to be able to concentrate. And that certainly is a big part of them growing as a student in general, not just in their reading. And then when they get into the reading selections, the individual stories like this one with Dottie and Spotty, there are words to watch for. They're specifically in that reading selection that they'll follow along with. And then at the end of the selection, there will be questions for them to think about. And you'll notice that the first of these is marked with an asterisk, which tells us it's going to be a thinking question, that they wouldn't just look back in the story and find exactly the answer spelled out. They have to think about it and draw a conclusion for themselves.
You know, when you made the comment, I know as you're transitioning to another example as well, Dottie and Spotty, it made me think of our last session when we were talking about phonemic awareness, because we emphasized the sounds that the child hears. And so that Audie that the child is hearing is just a part of him seeing the connection. So when you look at some of these names of the characters, like one thing I always chuckle about is Pig and Goose. But a lot of it is because we're developing that sound for them to enjoy the sound and connect it. So that's, yet again, you had mentioned all these elements are tied. That's some phonemic awareness that we're emphasizing too.
And finding that joy in the language as well. We mentioned that in the Abeka phonics program, we blend the consonant and the vowel sound together. Some other reading programs like to look at the end of the word, and they call them word families. And they will have the children practice all the words that end in at or something like that, which helps them if they're thinking about rhyming. This highlights that we do still work on the children's ability to rhyme and recognize rhyming, We just don't use it as one of our techniques for learning how to read. The next example that we have here for you is all kinds of animals. So we're going into the second grade, and this one actually is further along in the second grade year. But you'll see it again highlighted there that it says your student will gain fluency and a deeper level of comprehension through this informational book. There's certainly something to be said for reading in different genres that challenges the comprehension and the understanding in different ways. So we look for a variety in this particular one. Of course, children learn and usually will enjoy learning about animals, which helps them to be engaged with the story. Not that we always choose things that their students are their favorite, but it certainly helps with that. But what they're reading is valuable. Thinking about it is valuable. It bears mentioning that the Abeka reading program has another strand, if you will, that's consistent. We've already been bringing it up, that we teach everything from a biblical worldview. Reading is not done in a vacuum. Books are not amoral. We just basically mentioned this. What our students read is as important as that they learn how to read. Contrary to some opinions that will say that they don't care what children read as long as they are reading, but everything influences us. So let's choose wisely. And I think that if we were applying the verse from Philippians to the content of what we have the children read, we would say it would be better for them to read nothing than to read things that would influence them away from the Lord. It would not help them to build up their relationship with Him. So again, a little bit of a soapbox, but it's an important thing to keep in mind that we're talking about having Christian schools. All elements should contribute and help support that.
And this is a strong differentiator. Many of you are already well versed in expressing these thoughts to interested parents. But if this is not already routine to even be talking about not just how well the students read or how early that they read, but what they're reading, that is a tremendous distinction, as it should be, for a Christian school and the development that you're giving your students.
Again, this second grade reader that we're looking at is pulling from later in the school year, but we are consistent with having words to watch for to help them be prepared. And then longer reading selections that allow them to practice and improve their reading comprehension and their fluency, which is, I'm going to keep reminding myself that's specifically what we're on right here is the fluency. For the sake of just continuing this thought process, we also have some samples from the third grade through the seasons. There are other readers, of course, as well, but we have the opportunity through the seasons to help them in different literary settings, because as we are developing their reading skills, we also are helping them with other literary concepts like setting and characters. We've been practicing titles and authors since they were in kindergarten. This book will take them exploring not only with their imaginations, but also with going to different parts of the world and different seasons, some of which the children may never have experienced for themselves. And all of that contributing as they build their fluency.
And this introductory information says students will breeze through, and of course, it's enjoying the idea of through the seasons, but also if we're building fluency, we, Lord willing, want the students to be able to breeze through the sentences, paragraphs on the page as well.
And of course, the tie in there with the seasons
and
the breezes. So as we continue that thought, one of the tools that we have inside of our curriculum for our teachers are a number of reading qualities that we'll be particularly intentionally developing for our students. And I have those out on the screen for you here. We've got the top, what I always refer to as the top three: accuracy, comprehension, and expression. And then I kind of made the remaining 6 subpoints under expression. We're thinking about, as we think about things like enunciation, being able to say the words clearly, you can see where that would fall under the expression. It also ties in with the definition we talked about with fluency as well. Smoothness, meaning that we put pauses where they are appropriate and no extra ones unnecessary. The alertness to punctuation ties right in with that, because pauses are going to come through punctuation as well as the voice lifting up or coming down, depending on whether you have exclamation points or question marks, that kind of thing. So that is something we want our students to be aware of as they're reading, in addition to the letters that they're reading. Then, of course, volume, being loud enough or soft enough. And it could be very specific to the story, not just the audibility for others in the room to hear them, but if there's something in the story that makes it appropriate to be a little louder or a little softer as well. Definitely exposes not only their expression, but their comprehension of the story at that point. Speed is the second to last one. We will have students who read very, very fast, faster than they can really read accurately. So we need to have them slow down at least long enough to be accurate in what they're reading, as well as bringing in these other elements. But then you have others that may be reading so slowly that we've kind of lost the train of thought by the time they get to the end of the sentence. So it's a balance. And the last one being poise, in having our students be confident in their reading and being able to speak before others confidently. Really, reading class, it's the opportunity to begin their
professional
speaking, their public speaking. And where would we find how to decide which one of these 9 qualities of reading to work on for that particular day? They are recommended or suggested in the weekly overview of the reading program, because we know that as teachers, we can't concentrate on all 9 at once, and our students can't either. And there certainly is a logical progression or building of them. But in the overview, it's going to mention usually 2 for the week that the teacher will be intentionally listening for and helping her students. So when she gives specific praise, it will often include that element or that quality. Or if there's a specific correction, meaning you need to reread for, you might be working on smoothness. So reread for smoothness, or reread for punctuation, paying attention to those punctuation marks. That way the teacher is not trying to figure out for herself which one of these, or trying to, again, to cover all of them at once, because it's just too much to pay attention to. And that's where they would look to find that direction.
And again, a lot of these teachers in the younger grades, they're able to hear the individual students as they're working in those reading circles. That's giving them that opportunity for that individualized instruction. One of the things I found was interesting when I was reading up more on that national reading panel that published its results in 2000 that emphasized these elements that we now see in what we call the science of reading. It actually had a 6th element, and it was guided oral reading. It noted that young readers who have the opportunity to read to skilled readers to read out loud will not only have that practice of reading and reading out loud, but will also receive immediate feedback that they would need for improvement. So being able to have that designated reading time with your students, encouraging the parents, because in our younger grades, that's the only homework that the students have when they go home is reading, is really beneficial to their development and their fluency. And as we wrap up this part, again, now we've covered 3 out of the 5 elements. If you're keeping track, that means in our next and final part, we will cover the last 2. But let's remember, we've got 5 elements, but they're mainly divided into 2 broad categories: word recognition and then language comprehension. So in our next part, we will look especially at vocabulary and comprehension to really build up that element of language comprehension, because understanding what you read, being able to discern and use it, is ultimately the goal of reading. We look forward to seeing you in that part.